In this lesson, I want to talk about the significance of what we did in the previous lesson. I want to point out some relationships that might not be obvious. I want to explain why we did what we did and what was happening behind the scenes whenever we did it. Okay. Now, let me start at the very beginning here. As I was working inside of this default.aspx.cs file that you see on screen here, maybe you looked at it and said, how did he get bigger fonts? Mine are smaller than his. And how does he get that line number along the left-hand column? Well, if you recall, a couple of videos ago when we were setting up Visual Studio, there was a point when we signed in and I said it's pulling my personalized information from the cloud and setting up Visual Studio to my personal preferences. What I set my copy of Visual Studio on a whole other computer to change the font size, added the line numbers, and made a few other modifications. So let me show you where you can find those if you want to make those changes yourself. I would go to the Tools menu and select Options. And first of all, in the Environment tab here on the left-hand side, you want to drill down to Fonts and Colors, and you can see that I changed the size of the font. I think it's defaulted at 11 or 12, and I changed it to 14, which makes it a little bit easier to read, especially in a video. And to add the line numbers, I scrolled down and I went to the Text Editor tab and drilled down to the C# sub-tab. And you can see here that there's a check mark next to the word line numbers, which added the line numbers for me. Great. Okay. Also, let me point out that when I was typing, for example, here I'll just go to the end of this line of code, and I started typing result, and you can see that this little box pops up underneath where I'm typing. That's called IntelliSense, and it's going to become your best friend at some point. I didn't really even acknowledge it in the previous lesson, but it makes typing quicker and more accurate. So, for example, if I want to write the word result label, let's back it up here and just hit escape to get rid of it. Result, and now it's narrowed down the options to just those that start with the letters RES. All right, and so now what I can do is use the arrow keys on the keyboard to select one of the two items. It's either going to be this variable name I created called result, or it's going to be this the name of the server control called result label. And so that's probably what I want in this particular line of code. I would just then type the next logical operator to let it auto type the rest of the word for me. So in this case, I know I want to use the dot on the keyboard because I want to use the text property. I want to access or set the text property as my very next thing that I do. So I'm going to hit the period on the keyboard and it types out for me the rest of the word. Then it opens up IntelliSense again, and it shows me all of the properties that are part of the description of a result label, like the text property. It has it highlighted already. So all I need to do is just type the next logical thing on the keyboard, which would be a space, and it typed out the word text for me. Then I just have to hit the equal sign and I start that process again, use the up arrow on my keyboard, and then I'll just hit the semicolon for it to type out the rest. So I'm really only ever typing one or two letters and using the arrow keys, and then either the period, the space bar, the enter key, whatever the case might, or the semicolon, and it makes typing glorious and fast and fun. And it just takes practice, and you'll visually, as you're typing, you'll see it, and you'll be able to navigate to the options that you want to choose. Okay, so that's enough of that out of the way. I'm going to select that line and get rid of it so we're not confused by it. Okay. So I think the first thing that we need to do is talk about the relationship between this default.aspx and the default.aspx.cs. You can see over here in my Solution Explorer, I already expanded this. Yours would look like this, where you have default.aspx listed in the Solution Explorer as part of our project called My First Web App. And there's a little arrow next to default.aspx. When I click that arrow, it shows a hierarchy between default.aspx, the form we see on screen right now, and the what's called code behind. This code sits behind the form in a sense. Okay? This is code that executes on the server, on the web server. This is code that will ultimately be delivered and displayed to the end user. So that's the notion of a code behind whenever we use those terms. Okay? And as you'll come to learn, at the point of compilation, when all this source code that we write is compiled into a computer-readable format, this default.aspx and default.aspx.cs will be compiled together into a single thought, a single idea that represents one web page called default.aspx. Okay? We'll come back to that notion a little bit later. All right. Now, let's talk about server controls just briefly. As you can see, there are a ton of server controls in our toolbox, and they have these nice little categories for them. We've been working with several in the standard category, but there's also data server controls, which can be bound to a data source like a database. There are validation controls that will ensure that the data is in a correct format, or that you can't leave a certain field blank. You require the user to enter something or choose something. There are validators that ensure that you select within a given range of options, like 1 through 100. You can't choose 0 or 101, or else it will stop you, the end user, from moving forward with the web application. So that's the notion of validation. There's navigation controls. There are logging controls for those scenarios where you want to secure your website, make it password protected, but still allow people to retrieve their password that they forgot or reset it. Those are the types of things you can do with logging controls, and on and on. There are just quite a few of these stock server controls, and then there are companies that create server controls, and you can purchase entire libraries of them that have additional features built on top of these stock ones that come straight out of the box with Visual Studio. Now, let's talk about the purpose of the 3 controls that we use. Every control has one thing that it does really well that distinguishes it from all the other controls, or else it wouldn't exist. So in this case, a text box is good at retrieving or receiving alphanumeric characters from an end user, and they can type in anything they want. So that's the purpose of a text box, as an input for textual information. The button is great for allowing the end user to say, I want to take some action. I want to do something now, click, okay? And then the result label is good at displaying information. So we want to compose a message in our C# code. We need some place to put the end result message. We put it into a label by setting the label's text property. Okay. Let's talk about the relationship now between this click me button here and the code that we wrote in C#. And I said, well, let's double click the click me button, and that will take us into this area between an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. And you can see there are several layers of curly braces here. Every pair of curly braces are called a code block. And so in this particular code block, we have written our C# code. Now this code block has a name. The name is OK button. Wait, where did we hear OK button before? Oh yeah, that's the name we gave our button control, right? And then it used this underscore click. So it created this name as a for our benefit, really. It could have called it anything, but it called it OK button underscore click to let us know that this is the code that will execute whenever the button is clicked. And if we were to select our button control here on our designer and look at our properties window, and I'm going to pull this up a little bit, you can see that there's a little lightning bolt right next to this selected properties icon. And when I click the lightning bolt, you can see that not only do these server controls have attributes like their color, their size, what text they have inside of them. Those are things that we changed. But they don't have just things that describe their properties and their attributes. They also have things that they can do. You can click a button. And so whenever a button, an action is taken, a click action is taken, perform that the code block with that name, OK button underscore click. Great. And so now when we go back here, we know that this event handler, this code that handles that click event, will be executed. Okay, that's how they're wired up together, so to speak. Right? So what does this code do? Well, you can see that, first of all, I am using the names, the programmatic IDs of several of the server controls, the first name text box, the last name text box, the result label, and either retrieving their text attribute. In this case, this text attribute will hold whatever the end user typed in, and so we're going to take that value and store it somewhere for later use. We store it inside of a bucket that's just big enough to store that type of information. So that's why we declare a variable. We declare a variable by saying we need a bucket that's the size of a string. And the word when you think string, think a string of characters, all strung together on a clothesline. Okay? Individual alphanumeric characters that are all collected together, strung together. That's a string. So I need a bucket that's the size of a string that can hold alphanumeric characters, and I want to call that bucket, give it a name called first name. So if I ever need to get back at those string characters, I can just reference that variable's name, first name. Okay? And I do the exact same thing in the line below it, where I'm retrieving whatever the user typed into the text box by accessing the text property of that text box, which allows me to access its value, and I want to store it off into a variable, a bucket that's the size of a string in the computer's memory, and I want to name that bucket last name. Then I want to, and let me go ahead and hide the toolbox so we can see the rest of the line of code. In this third line on line number 22, now I'm creating yet another bucket that I intend to hold the final result that I want to display to the end user. I'm going to call that bucket result. Makes sense, right? And I am combining literal strings. Literal strings are in double quotes. I literally want that string of information appended, with the plus sign, added, to the bucket's content, the bucket called first name. Let's dump that information out into this line of code. I want to append it, add it to another literal string. In this case, that literal string will just have one empty space to create the spacing between first name and last name. Then I want to add the bucket from the computer's memory with last name in it. So we dump that out too. We combine all of this together and we set it into a variable called result. Now, and here we were retrieving the properties, and here we're setting the text property of the result label. Now, think with me for a moment. When we went here with the result label, we set its, let's get back over here to the properties. We set its text property to an empty string. We cleared out all the text, but we did that at design time. When we were designing the application, we set its default state for the text property to an empty string. But at runtime, we execute C# code, and we can still manipulate that property of that control by saying we want to set that property equal to whatever's in our bucket called result. And so that's how it works. Now, you might be wondering, well, if there's a bucket the size of a string, what other sizes of buckets are there? Okay, we'll talk about data types a little bit later. You might be wondering why all of these equal signs, these double quotes, these pluses, why is there a semicolon at the end of the line? That forms and describes the syntax of C#, which we'll learn in the next few lessons after we get it through some preliminary web page design type content, okay? But let's continue on. I think I said a moment ago that default.aspx page and the default.aspx.cs page, they get combined together at the point of compilation. All right, so you have to take source code that is human readable. You know, it's not stuff we would say every day, but I can still read. These are English words for the most part, just with some crazy characters mixed in once in a while. But we need to make it into a language that the computer will understand. More specifically, we need to put it into a format that the .NET framework and the .NET and the ASP.NET runtime can understand. And so that's the process of compilation. So we compile this code into what's called a .NET assembly. It's one or more files, typically one file, with either a .exe extension or, in the case of web applications, a .dll file extension. And that will be used and referenced whenever we want to serve up a web page. A web server will launch ASP.NET. ASP.NET will bring our DLL, our assembly, into play, and will say, I need the definition for a default.aspx. And our code will execute and say, here's what you need. And then ASP.NET will give it back to the web server, and the web server will send it back on its way to the end user's web browser. Okay, so that's kind of at a high level the interaction that takes place. But we have to compile our code, and where does that happen? When did we compile our code? Do you remember when we clicked on this little Internet Explorer button? The green run arrow with the word Internet Explorer. At the time when we clicked it, things exploded. Windows popped open in Visual Studio. I said, keep an eye on the task on the Windows tray off on the right-hand side. And then Internet Explorer pops open and our web page appears. Okay, well, that's because a lot of things happened all at the same time. The very first thing that happened was it compiled our application into a .NET assembly. It launched. Here, let's run this. Internet Explorer. Click it. Watch here in the system tray. Oop, there we go. Here's an icon. If you look in the lower right-hand corner there, IIS Express, as I hover my mouse cursor over it. It's a mini, tiny web server that runs on your computer, meant for development-only purposes. Okay, so Visual Studio launches Internet Explorer. It has our compiled .NET assembly, and it gives it to essentially, I said Internet Explorer. I keep saying that. I mean Internet Information Services Express, IIS Express. It gives it to it and says, here, we're going to request a web page from this assembly in just a moment. Then it launches Internet Explorer. There we go. Gives it the URL for that web page, and it says, please execute it. And so it calls that web server and says, hey, I need the default.aspx page, and our code runs and it renders out here to our web browser. Okay, so that many things happen all at the same time. I'm talking at very high level, in terms of what is actually happening under the hood to make all this happen. But hopefully you get at least some sense of the mapping of what we did and how that translated into a running application on our own computers. Okay? All right, and I think that's just about all that I really want to say. At this point, it's just a matter of learning a little bit more about the C# language itself that we wrote. We need to learn about these code blocks, the various levels, like here, this containing code block called a class default, and then a namespace, and then what are all these using statements. We'll get to all that really quick. But before we do that, we want to learn a little bit more about server controls and how to style up web pages, and then we'll dive into C#. That's the game plan that we started off with. So we'll begin that process in the very next lesson. See you there. Thank you.